A team of archaeologists at the University of Oregon have found one of North America's oldest human-occupied sites in southern Oregon.
In our first 2 forays out here, we found that 15,800-year-old ash, and underneath that we found camel tooth fragments.
What if everything you've ever learned about the first humans in America was completely wrong? Deep beneath the floor of a remote cave in southern Oregon, archaeologists uncovered evidence so extraordinary that even they refused to believe it at first. The samples were rushed to the laboratory, where the results stunned everyone. Certain there had to be a mistake, the team tested them again, and every single result came back exactly the same. The evidence pointed to an impossible conclusion. Humans were living in North America thousands of years earlier than modern history has claimed for over a century. If these findings are correct, one of the biggest chapters of human history will have to be rewritten from the ground up. But this discovery was only the beginning. What scientists uncovered next, beneath layers of ancient ash and Ice Age animal remains, would challenge everything we thought we knew about America's earliest inhabitants. Before we reveal the incredible evidence hidden beneath this cave, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because we bring you the world's most fascinating archaeological discoveries, ancient mysteries, and history-changing revelations. Now let's uncover the discovery that shocked archaeologists and could rewrite the history of America forever. The Paisley Caves and the discovery that changed history. Hidden within the rugged desert of south-central Oregon lies a series of quiet rock shelters carved naturally into a towering cliff. There are no busy tourist paths, no crowds gathering outside, and almost nothing to suggest that these caves hold one of the most important archaeological discoveries ever made in North America. Yet for decades, the greatest clue to America's earliest history remained concealed inside the Paisley Caves, while countless people unknowingly passed by. The first archaeologist to recognize the site's importance was University of Oregon researcher Luther Cressman. During excavations in the 1930s, he uncovered convincing evidence that ancient humans had once occupied these caves. He documented his discoveries and presented them to the scientific community, but because his conclusions conflicted with the widely accepted view of American prehistory, they were largely dismissed. The caves had revealed their story, but almost no one was willing to hear it. Years turned into decades. The site faded into the background, its discoveries stored away in archives while archaeologists focused their attention elsewhere. At the time, nearly every expert accepted a single explanation for how humans first reached America. According to that theory, the continent's earliest inhabitants arrived roughly 13,000 years ago by crossing an ancient land bridge that connected Siberia and Alaska during the Ice Age. This idea became the foundation of textbooks, museum exhibits, and university classrooms around the world. Few researchers wanted to investigate evidence that might challenge such an established belief. Eventually, a new University of Oregon research team returned to the Paisley Caves with modern excavation methods, working slowly and documenting every layer with extreme precision. They uncovered something completely unexpected. It wasn't a stone weapon or an ancient tool. Instead, they discovered preserved human coprolites, fossilized human waste that had remained exactly where it had been left thousands of years earlier. Although it may sound unusual, this was an extraordinary discovery. Nearly every other organic material inside the caves had long since decomposed. Bones, wooden objects, plant fibers, and countless other remains had disappeared with time. Yet the dry climate of Oregon's high desert had preserved the one type of evidence almost nobody expected to find: Ironically, the most ordinary thing produced by the human body became the most valuable archaeological clue. The discovery didn't end there. Surrounding the coprolites, archaeologists uncovered animal bones, woven plant fibers, and other signs of daily life. Together, these finds painted a clear picture. These caves were not simply a place where travelers stopped briefly. They were living spaces where families cooked meals, rested, and spent extended periods of time. For ancient people, the Paisley Caves were home. The samples were carefully preserved and sent for scientific analysis. However, researchers soon realized they faced another obstacle. At that time, technology capable of recovering ancient DNA from such old material simply did not exist. The evidence had already been discovered, but science itself needed years to catch up. As the samples remained safely stored away, the world continued teaching a version of history that the Paisley Caves had quietly challenged. When advances in genetic science finally made testing possible, researchers extracted DNA from the ancient coprolites. The results were unmistakable. The genetic sequences matched the ancestral lineages of Native Americans, including two maternal haplogroups known as A2 and B2. These were not just technical scientific classifications. They represented real ancestral family lines that continue through indigenous communities living across North America today, including the Ojibwe and several tribes of the Pacific Northwest. The people who once lived inside these caves were not members of a vanished population. Their descendants are still here. The next revelation was even more astonishing. Scientists dated the samples using accelerator mass spectrometry, a highly accurate technique that measures the age of the material itself rather than the surrounding sediment. The analysis revealed an age of more than 14,000 years. That date completely changed the timeline. It placed human occupation in the Paisley Caves at least 1,000 years before the arrival of the Clovis culture, the group long believed to represent the first people in the Americas. Lead archaeologist Dennis Jenkins published the findings, expecting scientific debate. Instead, he faced intense criticism. Rather than focusing on the evidence itself, many opponents questioned his credibility and challenged his conclusions in public. Once again, researchers who presented evidence against the accepted narrative found themselves under enormous pressure. Nearly 70 years separated Luther Cressman and Dennis Jenkins, yet both encountered the same resistance. The same caves revealed the same message, and once again, that message challenged an idea many considered untouchable. But to understand why this discovery caused such controversy, we first need to examine the theory that had dominated American archaeology for generations: the rise and fall of the Clovis first theory. For much of the 20th century, one explanation shaped nearly everything scholars believed about the earliest Americans. It appeared in textbooks, museum displays, documentaries, and university lectures across the world. That explanation became known as the Clovis first model, and the discoveries in Oregon forced scientists to reconsider nearly every part of it. The Clovis culture takes its name from Clovis, New Mexico, where distinctive stone spear points were first discovered during the 1930s. These carefully crafted weapons featured long grooves running through their centers, allowing them to be attached securely to spears while remaining lighter, stronger, and more effective for hunting large Ice Age animals. As similar tools were uncovered across North America, archaeologists concluded that the Clovis people represented the continent's earliest inhabitants. The theory itself was based on genuine archaeological evidence rather than speculation. According to the Clovis first model, these hunters entered North America around 13,000 years ago by crossing Beringia, a massive land bridge that once connected Siberia and Alaska. During the Ice Age, enormous glaciers trapped vast quantities of Earth's water, causing sea levels to fall dramatically. This exposed a broad stretch of land between Asia and North America, creating a natural route that is now submerged beneath the waters of the Bering Strait. According to the Clovis first theory, these early hunters crossed the Bering Land Bridge, traveled south through an opening in the massive ice sheets, and gradually spread across an empty continent. In this version of history, they were America's very first people. No one had arrived before them. For decades, that idea shaped the entire field of American archaeology. Careers were built around it. Museums created permanent exhibits celebrating it. University courses taught it as unquestionable fact. Challenging the Clovis timeline wasn't simply disagreeing with a date. It meant telling generations of experts that one of the foundations of American prehistory had been wrong all along. Yet there was one problem researchers rarely discussed. Although the ancestors of the Clovis people undoubtedly came from Asia, the distinctive Clovis spear points have never been discovered anywhere in Siberia or East Asia. Not a single confirmed example exists. The famous fluted weapons that define the Clovis culture appear to have been invented only after people were already living in North America. Even the accepted migration story contained a missing chapter that few wanted to confront. The debate also reached far beyond archaeology. For years, the Clovis first timeline appeared in legal arguments involving Native American land ownership, ancestral territories, and the protection of burial sites. If indigenous history on the continent stretched back only a relatively short time, certain legal claims became easier to challenge. The discussion was never based solely on science. It carried enormous political, cultural, and legal consequences. Those with interests tied to the existing narrative had little reason to welcome evidence that threatened it. By the 1990s, however, the evidence became increasingly difficult to ignore. Without public announcements or formal admissions of error, many museums quietly revised their exhibits. Information panels were rewritten, displays were updated, and old explanations slowly disappeared. There were no headlines admitting the previous story had been mistaken. The changes happened quietly, almost unnoticed. The discoveries in Oregon did far more than suggest the Clovis first model needed minor revisions. They demonstrated that the timeline itself could no longer stand, and only about 70 miles away, another archaeological site was preparing to push that history even further into the past. Rimrock Draw rock shelter. Near the small Oregon community of Riley, roughly 70 miles from the Paisley Caves, sits an unremarkable rock shelter known as Rimrock Draw. At first glance, it looks like little more than a shallow overhang in the desert landscape. Few would imagine that this quiet location would produce another discovery capable of reshaping American history. Beginning in 2011, University of Oregon archaeologist Dr. Patrick O'Grady launched a careful excavation at the site. The work demanded patience more than excitement. Season after season, the team dug through layers of soil, brushed away sediment grain by grain, and screened every bucket of dirt, often without finding anything remarkable. That slow, repetitive process is the reality of archaeology far more often than dramatic treasure hunts. Then everything changed. The team uncovered a thin layer of white volcanic ash preserved within the soil. Laboratory analysis linked it to a massive eruption of Mount St. Helens that occurred approximately 15,400 to 15,600 years ago. Although the volcano lies hundreds of miles away in Washington state, Its ash had spread across the region before settling permanently into the landscape. For archaeologists, this ash became an unmistakable timestamp. Every object above it had to be younger than the eruption. Every object below it had to be older. The volcanic event created a fixed point in time that could not be ignored. Beneath this ancient ash layer, researchers recovered 27 fragments of animal teeth. Some belonged to Camelops hesternus, an enormous Ice Age camel, considerably larger than any camel living today. Others came from Bison antiquus, an extinct species much heavier than modern bison, with horns that could stretch nearly 7 feet from tip to tip. Both animals had vanished thousands of years ago, yet their remains were sealed beneath the volcanic ash. This meant that the people living at Rimrock Draw had hunted some of the largest mammals of the Ice Age without metal weapons, horses, or modern technology. Armed only with carefully crafted stone tools, they survived in an environment filled with enormous and dangerous animals. Scientists believe that human hunting contributed to the disappearance of several Ice Age species, including these massive camels and bison. The people who once lived at Rimrock Draw may have been among those responsible, though they could never have imagined the lasting impact their hunting would have on the ecosystem. Then archaeologists uncovered the most remarkable object of the entire excavation. Roughly 10 centimeters beneath the animal remains lay a carefully crafted stone tool, placing it even deeper and therefore older than the fossils above it. Made from smooth orange chalcedony, the artifact had been expertly shaped for multiple purposes. One edge functioned as a knife for cutting, another served as a scraper, while a finely serrated section allowed it to be used like a saw. Instead of carrying several different tools, its owner had relied on one versatile implement designed for many everyday tasks. What fascinated researchers most was its condition. The tiny teeth along the serrated edge had been worn almost completely smooth. This wasn't the result of weathering underground. The wear patterns showed years of continuous use. Someone had depended on this tool day after day, season after season, until every sharp edge slowly disappeared through constant work. Eventually, that individual placed the tool inside the shelter and never returned. No one knows why. Perhaps they moved on. Perhaps they died. Their story has been lost forever. But the marks left on the stone preserve the silent record of an entire working lifetime. Radiocarbon testing of the nearby animal teeth produced astonishing dates between 21,000 and 22,000 years old. Since the tool rested even deeper in the soil, it had to be older still. Dr. O'Grady repeated the dating process using separate samples and independent laboratory tests. Both analyses produced the same extraordinary conclusion. He later admitted that holding evidence of such incredible age was unsettling, not because he doubted the science, but because he fully understood how dramatically these findings would challenge decades of accepted history. The artifact belonged to what archaeologists call the Western-stemmed tradition, a stone tool technology entirely different from the famous Clovis points. It represented another culture, another method of craftsmanship, and another population living in North America thousands of years before the Clovis people appeared. Now, 2 different archaeological sites in Oregon had produced independent evidence using completely different methods, yet both pointed toward the same conclusion. Humans were living in North America long before the timeline found in history books. But Oregon wasn't the first place where this evidence had surfaced. Many years earlier, on the opposite side of the country, another remarkable discovery had reached exactly the same conclusion. Instead of being celebrated, the archaeologists behind it spent decades fighting criticism for what he had found. Meadowcroft Rock Shelter. In western Pennsylvania, only a few miles from the Ohio River, stands a massive sandstone shelter known as Meadowcroft Rock Shelter. In 1955, local historian Albert Miller noticed something unusual after reaching into a groundhog burrow on the property. Hidden inside were ancient stone artifacts that clearly didn't belong there by accident. Miller immediately recognized that the objects could be extremely important. For the next 18 years, he contacted professional archaeologists, wrote letters, made phone calls, and searched tirelessly for someone willing to investigate the site. Again and again, his efforts were ignored. The evidence had been sitting beneath that Pennsylvania hillside since 1955. The scientific world simply wasn't ready to believe what it was trying to reveal. For years, the Meadowcroft site remained untouched. It wasn't until 1973 that archaeologist Jim Adovasio arrived and began a careful, systematic excavation. As his team slowly removed each layer of soil, they uncovered something astonishing: 52 separate archaeological layers stacked one above another, preserving one of the longest records of human occupation ever found in the Americas. No one questioned what had been discovered. The controversy centered entirely on its age. Radiocarbon dating indicated that people had lived at Meadowcroft between 16,000 and 19,000 years ago, placing human occupation thousands of years before the Clovis culture. When Adovasio published these results in 1980, the backlash was immediate. One of his strongest critics, geologist Vance Haynes, argued that the charcoal samples had been contaminated by ancient carbon from nearby coal deposits, making the dates appear much older than they actually were. Adovasio responded by testing that claim directly, carefully documenting every result and publishing a detailed rebuttal that addressed each criticism. Scientifically, the issue had been answered, yet the accusations continued to spread. Haynes's reputation carried enormous weight within the archaeological community, allowing his objections to survive long after they had been scientifically challenged. Sometimes a respected name can keep a weak argument alive far longer than the evidence deserves. The professional consequences for Adovasio were severe. Research funding quietly became harder to obtain. Colleagues who privately supported his conclusions often refused to defend them publicly, and hostile criticism followed him for years. Looking back, he described the experience as one of the most difficult periods of his career. He watched respected scientists choose to protect long-established beliefs rather than confront uncomfortable evidence. Eventually, researchers even coined a term for this resistance: Clovis primacy syndrome, describing the refusal to accept any evidence showing that humans reached the Americas before the Clovis culture, regardless of how convincing the data became. Albert Miller spent 18 years trying to persuade archaeologists to investigate Meadowcroft, while Jim Adovasio spent the next 40 years defending what that investigation revealed. Together, their story exposed a difficult truth. The greatest obstacle was never the artifacts themselves. It was the willingness of powerful institutions to accept what those artifacts meant. Even today, many archaeologists remain hesitant to embrace Meadowcroft's early dates, not necessarily because the evidence is weak, but because accepting those dates would require acknowledging that generations of respected researchers built their careers around an incomplete understanding of America's earliest history. Years later, discoveries in Oregon reached the same conclusion through entirely different methods, confirming what Adovasio had argued all along. The evidence had finally caught up with the truth, But another discovery, nearly 700 miles south of Oregon, would push the timeline back even further. This time, the evidence wasn't stone tools or ancient DNA, it was human footprints. White Sands National Park in southern New Mexico is unlike almost any other place in America. Endless white gypsum dunes stretch across the landscape, creating an almost unreal scene. During the Ice Age, however, this region looked completely different. It was covered by a massive lake known as Lake Otero. When the lake gradually disappeared, it left behind broad layers of hardened sediment beneath the desert surface. In 2009, researchers walking across this ancient lakebed noticed unusual impressions preserved in the ground. As they looked closer, they realized they were standing over human footprints. These were not faint outlines. Individual toes, arches, and heel marks were preserved with extraordinary clarity. Some belonged to adults, while others were so small they could only have been made by young children. It was a perfectly preserved moment from the Ice Age, capturing ordinary people walking beside a lakeshore thousands of years ago. Their footprints remained because they stepped into soft mud, which later dried, hardened, and became buried beneath fresh layers of sediment. The human tracks were accompanied by the footprints of Columbian mammoths and giant ground sloths, proving that humans and Ice Age animals occupied the same landscape at exactly the same time. Giant ground sloths were enormous creatures, weighing hundreds of kilograms and armed with massive claws capable of defending themselves against predators. One section of the site proved especially fascinating. Researchers noticed that a child's footprints appeared to follow directly behind the tracks of a giant ground sloth. Some scientists believe this pattern represents a young hunter learning to track dangerous animals under the guidance of experienced adults. If that interpretation is correct, it would be the oldest direct evidence of hunting behavior ever discovered in the Americas, and remarkably, it may have involved a child. Dating the site required extraordinary care. Instead of relying on a single test, 3 independent research teams examined 3 different materials from the same geological layer. They analyzed ancient seeds, conifer pollen, which is less vulnerable to carbon contamination, and organic material preserved within the ancient lake sediments. Every laboratory worked independently, yet every method produced essentially the same result. The footprints were between 21,000 and 23,000 years old. That date placed humans in North America during the height of the last glacial maximum, a period when the traditional Clovis first model claimed the continent was still completely empty. Publishing those findings proved almost as difficult as discovering them. During peer review in 2021, several anonymous reviewers attempted to prevent the paper from being published. The footprints had survived beneath the earth for more than 23,000 years, yet they nearly failed to survive the modern scientific review process. Once again, evidence challenging the established narrative encountered fierce resistance. Ironically, the footprints were only discovered because modern groundwater levels had fallen over time, partly due to human water use, exposing sections of the ancient lakebed that had remained hidden for millennia. Pure chance allowed one of humanity's oldest journeys across North America to emerge into the light. Scientists dated the California discovery using uranium-thorium dating, one of the most reliable methods for extremely ancient remains. The results were astonishing. Around 130,700 years old. If those findings continue to hold, they could completely reshape our understanding of when humans first reached the Americas. From the Paisley Caves to Rimrock Draw, Meadowcroft, White Sands, and now California, each discovery tells the same story. Human history in America is far older and far more complex than anyone once believed. What other incredible secrets are still hidden beneath the ground, waiting to rewrite history once again? If you enjoyed this video and want more amazing archaeology discoveries, ancient mysteries, and history-changing stories, make sure to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and leave a like. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next adventure.